Okay, let's spend some time continuing my journey toward having 2 spinal fusion surgeries in 3 days. Now, in the last edition, my primary care physician, who'd been treating me for pain with high doses of oxycodone, 120 milligrams a day, suddenly just stopped and refused to help me taper. This was just 3 weeks after he had added Valium to the mix. I have no idea what happened between the time he added Valium and the time he said, "Oop, I'm done." Instead of helping me taper, he wanted me to go to a drug treatment program, even though he repeatedly, both verbally and in writing, said I was not disordered. And in part 2, I talked about how it is the responsibility of the prescribing physician to help a patient taper. And there is no medical entity in the world, not the FDA, the CDC, any clinic in the world like the Mayo Clinic, that says the way you help a person taper is to send them to a drug treatment program, even though they're not disordered. And even if I wanted to go and be compliant, I could not go to a day program at that time because we were in the middle of the COVID pandemic and I couldn't go and sit around a bunch of people and then go home to my wife every day. So I had to find some way to come off of this medication without a dangerous cold turkey withdrawal deal and endangering my wife. So I had a real dilemma. I had 1 bottle left of the 120 milligrams a day of oxycodone, and that wasn't enough to do a safe taper. And I wasn't going to go to this day treatment center that my primary care physician wanted me to go to. And then I remembered something. A friend from a long time ago, and I'd recently heard that she was now the co-owner of a treatment center. So I called her, and she said she thought they could help, but that she didn't work there. She was a co-owner of it. So she set me up with an intake counselor, and I went over there and talked to him. And he said he thought it would take about 10 days, and that would cost $7,000. Well, he tried to get United Healthcare to pay for it, and they wouldn't. And you know why? Because I wasn't disordered. Nobody would say I was disordered. My primary care physician wouldn't say I was disordered, even though he wanted me to go to this treatment center. So, since I wasn't disordered, I wrote a check for $7,000. And I packed my bags and went to the center on June 20th, 2022. It's a very nice place. When I checked in, they searched me for any contraband stuff. I knew I wasn't supposed to have my cell phone, but I took a cell phone, an old one without a SIM card, and I asked if I could keep that one so that I could read my books on my Kindle app on the phone. And they said I could, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So then I was taken to my room where I spent most of my time while I was there, or a good bit of it. Now, my room was right across from the nurse's station, and there wasn't anybody else on the hallway with me until the last couple of days. In fact, I think there was only one other person in this first building who was there for treatment. Everybody else, as I said, were in those apartments in the back. Now, when I got into my room, you go in and you sit down, and it's kind of like, well, what do I do next? I presume that if you're there for treatment, then you get some kind of orientation and so on, but I didn't get that. So I was sitting there and I thought, I think I'll check the Wi-Fi. I didn't anticipate being able to have any. I looked and the center's Wi-Fi was password protected, but not far away, right there was a place called Terrapin Beer Company. And Terrapin Beer Company made beer, but there's also a place where you go and drink beer. And guess what? They had Wi-Fi and it didn't have a password. So I put on my headphones and turned it on, and I could watch my Netflix series and movies and the Andy Griffith Show. So I did that a lot. I was mostly under the covers in case somebody walked in. And shh, don't tell anybody about that. Now, if I'd been there for treatment, that would have been a different deal, but I wasn't. And it gave me a way to pass the time because I didn't participate in the treatment activities while I was there. And I wouldn't mind doing that, except that, again, that would be inside and I would be exposed to the outside staff who were going out in the community and coming back. And I wanted to limit that. So I didn't go to the treatment sessions. Now, the one place I did go to is for dinner and breakfast and lunch, and this is where we had that. It was a very nice food situation. It was a good way to get to know the other residents, and then we also spent a lot of time sitting around out here. Again, we were outside. I was only around people who never went anywhere, so exposure to the virus was limited. And I really enjoyed the time we spent there. I also spent a lot of time outside walking around. I was on my walker, and it's paradoxical, but it's very painful to walk, but walking with the walker helped with the pain too. So I would go out and walk around the parking lot and walk in here. There were steps up to where we went to eat, and it really disturbed some of the other residents when I would fold up my walker and negotiate the steps. So they started coming up and helping me. You know, there's nothing nicer than a bunch of recovering alcoholics and addicts. They were almost all drug addicts, or they all were. None of them were there for alcohol treatment. Really nice people. But when they would go off to their meetings, I would go back to my room or go for my walks. Now, I was told that I was going to be given Suboxone or transition to Suboxone off the Oxycodone. Suboxone is a medicine made up of buprenorphine and Noxolone. And what they said was if I transitioned to Suboxone, then I could be reduced and avoid severe withdrawal symptoms, and that sounded good to me. I knew nothing about Suboxone. All I knew about buprenorphine was what I had looked up after that pain clinic doctor was going to give me Butrans, which was buprenorphine that got into your system through the patch. So I didn't know much about it. It sounded good to me to get off of Oxycodone and not have to go through withdrawal symptoms, or so I thought. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, I think you should know something about Suboxone and why drug addicts are given Suboxone. So I'm going to show you this little 2-minute video that explains it all.
Medication-assisted treatment, or MAT, makes a huge difference for many people dealing with opioid dependence or addiction. But there's a lot of stigma and misinformation out there about MAT and the medications used in it. One question we often hear is, does Suboxone get you high? If so, won't it just be a new addiction? The short answer is no, Suboxone does not get you high. The longer answer involves a little science. The brain has 3 types of opioid receptors that are named after Greek letters: mu, delta, and kappa. These receptors have different roles, but the one we're going to focus on is mu. Mu receptors impact the ways we feel pleasure and pain, as well as a lot of other functions. A substance that binds to the mu receptors in the brain and activates them is called an opioid agonist. This includes the opioids that people take for pain relief and recreationally, like morphine, heroin, Vicodin, and fentanyl. Some substances bind to those same mu receptors, but activate them less strongly. These are called partial opioid agonists. Buprenorphine, the main medication in Suboxone, is a partial agonist. It forms a tight bond with the mu receptors, but it doesn't fully activate them, so it does not create the rush of pleasure or high that full opioid agonists can. Some people do feel mild euphoria when they first begin taking buprenorphine, but most people adapt to it quickly and stop feeling any euphoria when they take their dose. Even when you increase the dose of buprenorphine, the effects plateau. Taking more doesn't get you any higher. This is called a ceiling effect. Because buprenorphine is partially activating the brain's mu receptors, cravings for opioids are greatly reduced or eliminated. And because of the ceiling effect, a person isn't driven to seek more and more of the substance the way they are in addiction. This gives people a chance to get their lives back on track, repairing the damage that opioid use disorder may have done to their relationships, finances, jobs, and health. It can take years for the brain to recover from opioid use disorder, and for a person to learn new coping skills and healthier habits. But taking buprenorphine, even long-term, does not meet the diagnostic criteria for addiction. So, Suboxone does not get you high, and it is not just trading one addiction for another. Learn more about opioid use disorder and medication-assisted treatment like Suboxone at workathealth.com.
Well, my thanks to the folks at workathealth.com for allowing me to use that video. Most people who come in for treatment to the center left the center still taking Suboxone. Now, some of them would take it only for a short period of time. Some of them would take it for the rest of their lives because of the reasons you just heard. Now, I knew nothing about any of this stuff. I was a recovering alcoholic, and I had heard stories from people who were drug addicts and alcoholics. I just assumed this is some kind of magic pill that lets you avoid withdrawal symptoms. The first thing they had to do was transition me off the oxycodone to the buprenorphine. Now, as I talked about when I talked about that pain clinic doctor wanting to put me on Butrans, I had to get into full withdrawals from the oxycodone before they could give me buprenorphine, or else I would go into a really bad withdrawal called precipitated withdrawal. So I had taken my last dose of oxycodone right before I entered the center, I think sometime around noon, and I didn't take any more. And they kept checking with me, and really I didn't have really bad withdrawal symptoms. But after about 12 hours, they said we could go ahead and I could take the first dose of Suboxone. Now, I don't know what the dosage was. Let me explain dosages for Suboxone too. And to do that, I have to talk about morphine milligram equivalent, or MME. In order to compare opioids, they've developed this system that compares everything to morphine. So 1 milligram of morphine is worth or the same as how many milligrams of opioids, of other opioids, because the strength of these opioids and how they affect your body varies. So 1 milligram of morphine, for example, is the same as 1.5 milligrams of oxycodone. So, for example, if you're taking 45 milligrams of morphine, that's the same as 30 milligrams of oxycodone. Remember, it's 1.5 times as strong. Well, buprenorphine is 30 times as strong. By strength, it's not by how high it gets you and stuff. It's really how many of the opioid receptors it fills up and how tightly. And as we talked about, and you saw in the video, buprenorphine fills up a lot, all of the opioid receptors very quickly and binds tightly. So 2 milligrams of buprenorphine is equal to 60 milligrams of morphine. So when they transitioned me after I had been in withdrawal for a while in the middle of the night, that night, about 12 hours after my last dose, so I guess a little after midnight, they gave me my first dose of buprenorphine, or Suboxone. And I don't remember the dosage, but it was something like 16 milligrams. And then they dropped those milligrams quickly every day. By the time I was at about the 10th day, I was down to 4 milligrams and then 2 milligrams. And I had a misunderstanding. I thought that by the 9th day that I was down, I was 0. I thought I was off. The pain was getting worse. I mean, I still had this severe pain. I was still on a walker, but I still wanted to come totally off the oxycodone. But as we got to the 8th and 9th day, the nurses began talking to me about how buprenorphine is used for pain. I mean, it is an opioid after all. And they asked me if I wanted to talk to their doctor about using buprenorphine for pain. Now, there was a doctor who their patients went to who had prescribed Suboxone for them after they left the center. Because again, remember, a lot of them were on it for the rest of their lives, and this doctor would prescribe it for them. So I still wanted to get to 0 on the opioids, but yeah, I was willing to go talk to this doctor. Well, I did, and he was a very nice guy. He had a regular practice, but he also did this for the center. And he talked about how he had patients who took buprenorphine for pain, and did I want to try it? And I thought, well, yeah, I'll try it. I mean, it didn't get you high, and I thought it's not hard to come off of. I just did it, or I'm almost done. So sure. So he went back to, increased it to 8 milligrams twice a day. But what I found out later was that I still was on 2 milligrams of Suboxone on the day that I was supposed to get out. And what I found out later is that the first 2 milligrams of Suboxone fills up 70% of your opioid receptors. And that's why it's so easy to go from high doses down to 2 milligrams, because you don't have many opioids left to lose, because they're going to, when you're at 2 milligrams, you still have 70% of your receptors being filled by the buprenorphine. So you don't feel withdrawal symptoms because they're still there. But coming off of that last 2 milligrams, a booger. And from all witnesses that I've heard from, it's a whole lot worse than coming off of oxycodone. So if I had to do it over again, what I would say is, no, I don't want to take Suboxone. What I want is to have a very fast taper off the oxycodone, like in 5 days, and have medical supervision. So I'm not sitting here going through awful stuff that my wife has to deal with, and that I have to keep wondering, do you need a doctor here because I'm just feel like I'm dying, and then coming out of that at 0 like I wanted to. If I had to do it over again, that's what I'd do. But that's not what happened, and I left the center as a patient of Dr. Brooks, where I was going to use buprenorphine through, although he kept prescribing Suboxone instead of just buprenorphine, and I don't know why. I guess that's just what he did. But that turned out to be a difficulty for me because he also referred me to a pain clinic. In fact, the same pain clinic that had done the injections and told me they had nothing else for me, but he wanted me to go see them again. So made an appointment, and I had to fill out some forms, and on that form I had to fill out everything all the medications I was taking and everything. And I was back home, and I was walking up the street on my walker. I would always take a walk around the block on my walker, and that's a story which I'll talk about later. But as I was walking up my street, I got a phone call, and it was from the treatment center, and there was an empty house right there, so I went and sat on the front steps of that house and talked to him. And this nurse told me that they weren't going to be able to see me. I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, the doctor wouldn't see me." And there was a pause, and then I said, "Is that because I'm taking Suboxone?" And there was another pause, and she said, "Yes." So now I'm a medical pariah because I went to the treatment center and I'm taking Suboxone, which is what drug addicts take. Now, I don't know how drug addicts get treated for pain, but apparently not at that pain clinic. Meanwhile, I go back to my rock star neurosurgeon who decides we're going to do another surgery. Now, when I look at her notes, it says that she told me that she didn't think another surgery would do any good, but that I said I wanted to do one. I don't remember it that way. I mean, I don't remember her saying that another surgery wouldn't do any good. I'm not sure. I don't know why we would do another one if it wouldn't do any good. But I don't doubt that she said that, and I was desperate, and I said, well, let's try it anyway or something. I don't know. So that was scheduled for December, and it was going to be a discectomy where she would go in and clean out the goop from the spinal canal from the herniation. Meanwhile, I could not stand, walk, nor sit without intense pain, so I began spending all of my time lying down, or a good bit of it. I would walk around the block. As I said, it was 7/10 of a mile around the block. At least 4 times during the walk, I would have to lie down. Now, I got to tell you, when you're on a walker and there's a walker sitting there and a guy lying down next to it, that disturbs people, and they stop, and they're walking along. Are you okay? So I started carrying this sign, and I would hold it up, and it said, "I'm okay." And that worked for most people. Every now and then there'd be this, I call them little old ladies, some of them younger than me. And I would hold up my sign and say, "Yeah, I'm fine." And she would lean over in a car and say, "Are you sure?" And I would say, "Yes, I'm fine." "Do we need to call somebody?" "No, I'm fine." And I'd be waving my sign, "I'm fine, I'm fine." When somebody's holding up a sign that says, "I'm okay," and says, "I'm okay," just say, "Oh, good," and move on. Don't make it worse by insisting on helping when no help is needed. Anyway, I couldn't go very far without lying down, and I hadn't. Later, I learned to adapt to this by holding myself up and stuff, but I was driving short distances, but it hurt. The whole time I was sitting there, it would be very painful. So I figured out, I didn't go very many places. There was a grocery store not far from us. I went to some. Mostly I went to doctor's appointments. And there's a medical complex that got started about 15 minutes from our home. I would have to drive out there on occasion, and I needed places where I could stop and get out of the car and lie down and let the pain die down. And I discovered soon churches were a good place for that, because if it wasn't Sunday, it was mostly empty parking lots. And I could pull in and go way to the back and hide myself from the street by lying down beside the car so people wouldn't call an ambulance if they saw an old guy lying out by his car. So I would drive to the first church, St. James Methodist Church, and I would stop it was a few minutes from my house, and I would lie down and let the pain go down, and then I would get in the car and drive to the next church, which was an Anglican church, and I would go back behind that and lie down. There was one stoplight on the way, and I remember sitting there, and it was a long red one, and just screaming because the pain was so bad and I couldn't get out and lie down. And then I would get to the center, and then being in the doctor's office was difficult. I would sit there just in extreme pain until they called me. Sometimes I would go to a bathroom and lie down for a little bit and then go out and wait again. And then when I got in the room, I would lie down on the floor and waited. They all had examining tables, but I didn't want to mess up the paper that's on there and make the nurse have to clean it just because I can't sit. So I would lie down, the doctor would come in, I'd jump up and pretty much jump up. I could do that. And that came up in a note later I'm going to tell you about. But this was really difficult. I talked about going to the grocery store. I would go to the store and I'd go in, and the produce department was the first department, and then there was a bakery department, and then there was a bathroom back there. And by the time I got to the bathroom area, the pain would be so bad, I would go into the bathroom, lock the door, and I'd lie down. Fortunately, they really kept these bathrooms clean, but I didn't have any other choice. And then I'd get down to the milk area, and there wasn't any place to lie down, so I'd lie on a corner and I would pretend to be tying my shoe so people wouldn't get all upset because I was lying down. And then there was another bathroom in the back right corner before you check out. Checking out was a problem. If I had to wait in line, it would just get bad. And there was one time when, by the time I got up to the clerk, I was just dying, and I said, look, I'm going to lie down right here, but I'm fine. I'm okay. Remember my Costco story? It's a similar one. I'm just fine, but I'm just in pain, and I'm going to have to lie down, but it's okay. I've just got this back issue. And I lie down, and this other person saw me, and it's the whole deal with the Costco again. They're all running around saying, call 911. So I had to get up and say, I'm fine. And I lived this way for like 2 years, but I did learn how to adapt and do some things differently, which I'll talk to you later about. Meanwhile, before the surgery, which is going to be in December, my neurologist referred me to another pain clinic in town, one that's well established and has been around. And I got a call from them. No appointment was ever made because I just got a call saying they wouldn't see me. I didn't ask. I presume it's a Suboxone. But as I said, I was a medical pariah. And that's going to come up again later in the story. But now, after I got out of the treatment center, I had an appointment with my primary care physician. I had one scheduled for the time I was in the center, so it had been postponed. Now, he wasn't treating me for pain, but I had other issues that required monitoring, like my heart disease. He prescribed my statin for me and other things. And I went to that appointment expecting to get medical care, but instead, I got something else. So I finally had an in-person visit with my primary care physician. Remember, everything that had gone on since he added Valium to the mix of what I was given for pain had been done by email. So I went to this appointment expecting to have a medical visit where he did the normal things like listen to your heart and test your reflexes and all that, but that's not what happened. He came in the room and sat down on the stool and then got over right in front of me and started in on this rant where he went down this list of all these things that had happened in the past. And I was really in a state of shock. And when he finished with his first item, I started to respond to it, and he held his hand up and said, nope, nope, nope. Let me finish. And then he went to one item and the next item and the next item. And every time I would start to respond, nope, let me finish. And then when he finally finished, man, I couldn't even remember what he had said. I came in for a medical appointment. I didn't come in ready to take notes about some kind of lecture and rant that he was giving me. But I was desperate because I needed a primary care physician, so I just sat there and was as solicitous as I could be. And I don't remember what else happened at the rest of the appointment, but I went home, and after a while, I sat down and wrote an email to him in response to this lecture/rant that he had gone on. And I'm going to read some of this email that I sent to him and then comment on it. It has been a while since our meeting. I had to spend some time working through a resentment, which is a number one trigger for a relapse. Resentment is another word for angry. I was pretty pissed off and was holding all that inside because I needed medical care. But what I went on to write, I came for an appointment to deal with my medical issues. I felt that I walked into a carefully planned ambush, and I had to get over that resentment, and I have, and I did. I talked to my sponsor about it and worked through all the tools that I have for dealing with that, and so I was pretty settled down by the time I wrote this. Second paragraph, during your presentation, you mentioned several things that happened in the past. Again, I presume that those things didn't concern you at the time, given that you continued to prescribe high doses of oxycodone to me, as well as other potentially addictive drugs. I was prepared for a visit involving my medical condition, so I don't have a memory of all those things you said. I wasn't ready to take notes. And then, you see, my concern was still that he thought I was, and I don't want to say relapse because I've never had a drug problem, but relapse in terms of sobriety. And so I write, I can tell you with certitude that none of those behaviors had anything to do with a relapse. It just had to do with my dealing with pain and living life. I've talked about this before, but we need to have a Mr. Spock machine that allows the doctor and other people to feel what you're feeling. I was dealing through all of this with mind-boggling, intractable pain whenever I moved, and eventually whenever I sat. So this whole time, when I'm just trying to survive, and that's what I'm getting at there. And then I write, there are a couple of things I do remember, and I need to address them. I wrote, it seemed to me you had a pretty good resentment, he did, toward me because you believe I told him that you refused to treat me for pain, that I'd told people that. That was the first thing he said, and I do remember that part pretty good because I thought it was a very odd thing to say since he did refuse me for pain. But I wrote, I never said that you refused to treat me for pain, not in those words. And I didn't. When I sent you my tapering plan, your response was that you were not interested in my, quote, a logarithm. That's how you put it. You said that you had referred my pain treatment out and that you would not be treating for pain. Previously, my primary care physician had told me to tell the neurosurgeon's office that he was treating me for pain after those surgeries. And I had done that. So now the neurosurgeon's nurse had said, he's treating you for pain. And I said, no, he's not treating me for pain anymore. And as I write here, I was just stating what my understanding was. And then I write, I have never ever said anything but positive things about you. I apologize if anything I said came back to you in a negative fashion. Well, I was being solicitous. I didn't think I needed any apologies. I didn't do anything except tell people he wasn't treating me for pain anymore, which he wasn't. And the last sentence, I was just trying to obtain treatment for my difficult condition, and I had to explain my situation as I understood it. I mean, this deal of, you told people I wouldn't refuse them, this is crazy. And then I wrote, regarding my writing out prescriptions for you, I did that to help you. I've talked about this before, but I need to explain it here. He, in his rant, said, and you brought in those papers, and as if I was trying to manipulate him into giving me more oxycodone somehow. And that was nuts. When he initially started prescribing oxycodone for me, he would write it on prescription pads, and he had no problem doing that. But the group that he worked for told him at some point that they had to write out the prescriptions and do it through the computer, do it online. And he told me he didn't like to read, and he told me that he wasn't good at computers. So at the end of every appointment, when I went in every 3 months and he would write out 3 prescriptions for me, he would stand up at the end of the appointment and he would say, come with me. And I would go back with him down the hall to his office, and I would stand there in the doorway leaning on the door frame while he typed in these prescriptions. He had to write 3 of them for the next 3 months, and you'll see in a minute, each prescription had different dosages because I took different things at different times of the day. I was using immediate release oxycodone, so I could do that, fine-tune that. And he would write in the computer, and then he would repeat it, and a lot of times he made some mistake, and I'd help him get it right. So I was doing that every time I went in for an appointment, so I decided that I would just try to help him out by coming in with these already written out. And this is from my files, and it's a copy of an exact one that I brought to the appointment with him every time. And I would just write out what he had prescribed the previous month, and you can see the 3 different levels, and then I would put the fill dates on it so he didn't have to figure that out. And then I try to help him. This wasn't part of the prescription, but in order for him to feel good about what we were doing, I wrote out how I was using these medications he was prescribing. And at the end of every appointment, I'd have those papers in my hand, and he would stand up and he'd say, give me those. And he would walk to his office and he would set them down and he would make the prescriptions on the computer using the guideline that I gave him. So I wrote, regarding my writing out the prescriptions for you, I did that to help you. I never did that for any other purpose. You, by your own admission, struggled with writing out all those prescriptions on the computer. So it's my nature to help. I wrote these prescriptions out to make it easier. You never seemed to mind. In fact, you would ask for them as you left the room to go to your office. There were times when you would call me into your office and ask for clarification. If you believed my effort to help you was actually some request for more drugs, I wish you had said something to me then, each of those many, many appointments where I did this. And then I don't remember for sure that he, other than acting as if those prescriptions were some way to manipulate what he was prescribing me. I don't remember him saying out loud and straight up that I was asking for more doses. But I went ahead and said this paragraph regarding my occasional and rare request for an increased dose that was always in response to increased pain. And then I go on to say that, I've never had any, as I've talked before here, I've never had any or much mood change as a result of the oxycodone I was taking. But even if I did get it, I don't like the way that feels, and I was glad when it was over, but it was only minutes. And then I wrote, perhaps I totally misunderstood, but I didn't misunderstand. He made this reference to my going to the Serenity Grove Residential Treatment Center rather than the day treatment center as some sort of avoidance thing. So I go on to explain why I did that, about not wanting to bring the virus home to my wife. Now, this last paragraph, this was really an incredibly nasty kind of thing to do. He went on this rant about how I insisted on doing all these physical activities, and it was my fault that I was in this position I was in of having all this pain. Now, I had already told him that I had come to accept my disability, and that if I had to do over again, I wouldn't ask for additional dose so I could do yard work, that I would have split it up between 2 days. I mean, I'd already talked to him about that. And at the time that I did that, I had just begun on this journey, and I wasn't out doing WWE wrestling or anything. I was just doing yard work. But he talked about the laundry basket that caused the herniation. And I said in here, I've readily admitted that I shouldn't have carried that laundry basket down. That was an error. But to have a doctor tell me it's because of your, and these are his quotes, faux pas, that you're in this position, that's just BS. But I go on to say in this paragraph, actually, I never did anything that was contrary to the directions I was given after the surgery that I had, or the surgeries. I followed the directions exactly. All I did with the laundry basket was fail to use my legs when I put it down the way I should. And yes, it was too heavy. When I picked it up and thought, this is heavy, I should have just left it there. But that's no reason for my primary care physician to go off the way he did on that. I don't know. I never got a response to this email, but as I said, I was talking to my sponsor about this, and somehow an arrangement was made with another meeting where the primary care physician was meeting with me and my sponsor. So we met together, and man, we had the same exact experience. He just went off on the rant again, and I couldn't respond again in the same way that it happened before. Except this thing, he added something. He said, and I am not responsible for you being on Suboxone. Well, first of all, I was like, I never said you were. I don't know where that came from. I never told anybody that he was responsible. I didn't even thought about it. It didn't even occur to me. But now that he mentioned it, I thought, I didn't say it because I still needed him as a primary care physician. But I thought, yes, you were. I was on Suboxone because you would not do your job and help me taper off the oxycodone that you had prescribed. So I had to do something, and so I ended up taking Suboxone. Don't tell me you're not responsible for it, but I didn't say anything. Well, after that, time passed. And in November of 2022, a month before my third back surgery and second discectomy on the same level, my primary care physician began treating me for pain again. But that didn't last very long. Pretty soon, he wasn't treating me for pain anymore, and it's worse than that. And then, what is usually true, if you keep doing the next right thing, things get better. I promise you that at some point, things are going to get better. But first, they're just going to get more bizarre and more wackadoodle with my primary care physician. Now, just to be sure the timeline is straight in your head, it was early June of 2022 when my primary care physician said, I'm not treating you for pain anymore, and he refused to help me taper. And it was mid-June 2022 when I went to the residential treatment center hoping to get off the oxycodone, but ending up getting switched to Suboxone because I didn't know any better. And it was August of 2022 when I had the appointment with my primary care physician, and he went off on that lecture with all that stuff that I talked about earlier. And then in September of 2022, I met with my primary care physician again, this time with my AA sponsor, and got the same lecture, except he added, I am not responsible for you being on Suboxone, which I had never said, but of course he was. So now we're moving into November, and I have an appointment with my primary care physician again, and I don't remember how that got set up, but for some reason I had an appointment, and so I went. This was on November 9th, 2022. And this is a totally different primary care physician. He was his old jovial self. I mean, I came in, he was laughing. It was like the old days when he was writing to me in emails, Ed, you're a wonderful father. Ed, you're a good friend. Ed, this and that, all these stuff. Ed, I approve of what you're doing. Ed, you're doing a good job. Ed, I admire your fortitude. I mean, this was like we had come back. And really, I thought, hey, he's gotten over his COVID brain. You know, he's well again. This is cool. So these are his notes from that November 9th session. This is a 1-hour visit during which time we go over the history of him giving me pain medication. And he says, going back to around 2012, I think it was between 2010 and 2012, closer to 2010. But he says something interesting. The records are not there in his practice because he changed medical groups and my records didn't follow to him. I don't know why that is. Why wouldn't my records go with him? But apparently he didn't remember how long he had been giving me oxycodone. And then he says 1 month ago we gave him, and he means, this is a dictation thing, buprenorphine and noxolone, that is Suboxone. I'm not sure if he meant to say he gave me or that I was given that by this other doctor, because I don't remember him prescribing Suboxone to me. At any rate, he's saying I was taking Suboxone. And then he says, I stated it didn't work well for me. Well, yeah, I did. I was still in pain, and that wasn't helping. And then he talks about long QT syndrome. This was a just incredibly horrible, sad event when my sister's 16-year-old son, my nephew, went to bed one night and died. Well, because of that, there became a concern that he might have had some sort of heart issue that caused him to die suddenly. So our family became a study family for an organization called Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndrome. And there was a doctor, Dr. Michael Vincent, who was a world-renowned guru for one of those syndromes called long QT syndrome. And because of that, everybody in our family had a genetic study. And this was early in the genetic studies for long QT. And it turned out that my father, my sister, my brother, and me all had the gene, one of the genes, or three of them, for long QT syndrome. And when you have this gene, it causes your heart to go into an arrhythmia. And the first symptom is often sudden death. Now, the way you treat people with this gene is to give them beta blockers, and I take one, atenolol. And that keeps your heart from going into this sudden arrhythmia that causes death. Well, in addition to that, there are certain medicines elongate the QT. And there's a whole big old long list of medicines that people with the gene that my family has should not take because it puts them at increased risk for an arrhythmia and sudden death. And I finally got around to checking, and it turns out buprenorphine is on that list. So I asked if we could go back to oxycodone. I'm guessing that he was his old self, so I thought I would ask. Now, as a part of that request, because I really wanted him to do it, I wanted to get off this Suboxone, I suggested I take 5 milligrams 3 times a day. Now, I was going from the equivalent of 120 milligrams of oxycodone all the way down to 15 milligrams of oxycodone. And that's basically cold turkey withdrawal. Again, a year later. But still, at this point, I was willing to try to get anything I could to make it easier to come off of this stuff. Well, he said, why don't we do 10 milligrams 3 times a day? He suggested double what I suggested, 30 milligrams. Well, I want to come off of it, but I want to come off it slowly. And I said, okay, that'll help. I did ask that we have immediate release like I did for 4 years, and I never got tolerant, and to continue to take or go back to taking Zolpidem. So we go home, and now I'm starting to take I'm having a sudden drop-off in the oxycodone, and as you might expect, things got worse. I mean, part of it was the withdrawal symptoms started, and then the pain got worse. And I began to thinking what I had done is when he gave me this, I just started taking the oxycodone and didn't take the Suboxone anymore. And as I started feeling really bad and worse and so on, I thought maybe I should have tapered on the Suboxone at the same time I'm doing the oxycodone. So a couple of days later, I called the office and I talked to his nurse. And I said I was in a lot of pain and that I needed directions on how to taper off the Suboxone and then start taking oxycodone. I had just switched over because that was my understanding of what I was supposed to do, although the primary care physician had not said that explicitly. And so she checked with my primary care physician, who said I should stop taking the Suboxone and just start taking the oxycodone. So I said, okay. And then she says wife called back to say patient was in a lot of pain, and she asked about tapering. And then I guess my wife called. I didn't know she had done that. So I continued to do what I did 2 days earlier, which is just quit taking the Suboxone and keep taking the oxycodone. That was on a Friday, and 2 days after that, on Sunday, the pain had gotten so bad and just would not quit. And I don't know if this was from partially the withdrawals and just I needed more than 30 milligrams a day, because, I mean, that's what I'd been taking. It wasn't even working too good. So I went to the ER, and I remember that trip over really well because I hadn't learned how to drive yet by lifting up like that. And I don't know, I was in such a shape I probably shouldn't have driven anyway. So I lay down in the back of that Camry, and that's a hard thing to do. A Toyota Camry, the back seat's like 2 bucket seats. It's got this big hump in the middle. And lying on that was really difficult. I had to put my legs out the window. I thought we might get stopped by the police on the way over there. So we go on to the emergency room, and he talks about constant back pain. Well, I guess they call it back pain because I say it's emanating from the back, but without relief from pain meds. He ends up giving me Dilaudid hospital heroin again, and that helped with the pain. I could go home. But look, down here, I want you to see this, the highlighted part in the bottom. He has not taken Suboxone in 4 days. Remember, as soon as I prescribed the oxycodone, I quit taking the Suboxone. 2 days later, I called the nurse to make sure I was doing right. She said I was. And then 2 days later, I know I've talked about doctor's notes not being right, but this would be a weird one to make up. And I know it's true. I'd quit taking the Suboxone, but this substantiates the fact that I had quit taking the Suboxone. So during this time, when we were in the emergency room, I was lying on the floor because I couldn't sit, and I was in awful pain. And remember, the primary care physician had given me his cell number years before and said, use it. So my wife called the primary care physician and told him we were in the emergency room and that the amount of pain medication I was taking was just not sufficient for the pain I was in. And my primary care physician told her I could go back to what I was doing, the 120 milligrams a day with the medication I had taken. He told my wife he knows how much medication he has in the bottle and said I could go back to that. So I went home from the hospital, and I went back to taking 15 milligrams every 3 hours, is what I was doing a year ago when he said he wasn't going to treat me for pain anymore. But he had just told my wife I could go ahead and do that. Well, this was on a Sunday. On Monday, I needed to have an appointment with him to get another prescription because obviously I was run out of the oxycodone. And I didn't want to go cold turkey where I was a year before. So I called to make an appointment, and I was told I could see him in a month. And I said, I can't see him in a month. I've got to see him this week because I'm going to be out by, I think it was Friday. I'm going to be out, and I don't want to go cold turkey. So she called me back and had an appointment on Friday. So we go in on Friday. And let me tell you about this appointment we had. We went in, and again, my wife drove me because I couldn't drive. And we're not the kind of old couple that goes to doctor's appointments and sit around together and go in together normally. But she was there, so I said, why don't you come with me when I was called back? And she did. And she knew our primary care physician well, but they were well acquainted. And he came in, and it was the old jovial self. It wasn't a very long appointment. He laughed, had a lot of pleasantries with my wife. Yeah, it was a very nice appointment. And he wrote a prescription for 120 milligrams a day and gave it to me. And we walked out. Now let's look at his notes. Ed and his wife come in for follow-up. At last visit, we had arrived at oxycodone 10 milligrams 3 times a day. Then he writes this. Ever on his own, he was still taking Suboxone also. In his mind, he should taper off Suboxone, even though I told him he should stop it abruptly and start the oxycodone. First of all, we didn't talk about anything in this appointment that we had. He didn't ask me, are you taking Suboxone? Why do you take Suboxone? Or anything. The only thing I can figure out is the nurse asked him about it when I called in, and then apparently my wife did. So he made this assumption that I was tapering off Suboxone, but he didn't ask me. So he's making medical decisions on something it's just incorrect. And then he wrote he went back and forth taking Suboxone and Oxycodone. Never did that. And he never talked to me. And I don't know, there's a sentence here, Suboxone was November 10th. I don't know what that means. That was about the last time I took Suboxone. And then he says the emergency department last weekend. I guess he means he went there. And the next sentence really doesn't make sense, and it should be 15 milligrams every 3 hours. And then he says something about 20 milligrams every 3 hours. Actually, what it was 15 milligrams every 3 hours. Then he wrote, has become very confusing and confounding. Well, it wouldn't have been confusing and confounding if he had just asked us about it. If he was confused and confounded, he should have said, I'm confused and confounded. Tell me something about this. Or why did you do this? Or what are you doing? I mean, he didn't say anything. We didn't discuss any of this in the actual meeting. And then he says, I have a surgery date for December 19th, and he talks about spinal stenosis and so on. And then he writes, she contacted the office yesterday in a panic, stating that he had to get refill for his medication because I have given them authorization to take more. Well, first of all, she didn't call. I did. And yes, I was in a panic because I needed to have a refill. And it wasn't yesterday. It was several days before. So, he doesn't have a clue here. And again, we didn't talk about any of this. But he says, because I gave authorization to take more, he says, this is true. So he remembered and admits that he told me I could do this. So I don't know what I was supposed to do without getting another appointment for him to refill, since I wasn't going to have enough without going cold turkey again. And then he wrote, however, did not recognize that it was going to come to another very confusing visit. Well, I don't know what other confusing visits we had. You saw all the emails we had previous to his deciding to not treat me for pain anymore. And it sure didn't sound confusing. None of it did. And nothing would have been confusing or confounding if he had just said something in this appointment. And he didn't. It was just a short appointment with a lot of joviality in it. So my wife and I get up and walk out, and I've got the prescription in hand. And as we walked out past the checkout place, there's a nurse's station kind of in the back there, and his nurse was there, and I had worked with her for many, many years. And I called her name, and I said, I'd like you to meet my wife. And she kind of halfway turned around but kept working, and that was unusual. She's usually very friendly. That's odd, but anyway, I guess she's busy. Well, then when we turned around, there's a staff member standing there with an envelope, and she said, I need to talk to you. And she takes us in this other little room and gives me the envelope and says that Dr. Primary Care Physician is dismissing me from his practice for being, and I read the letter, and it's because I'm too complicated. So we had just been in this appointment with him, didn't say anything about this, just a jovial, friendly appointment. And on the way out, a staff member has to be given the duty to tell me that I'm no longer going to be his patient. Well, my response to her was, I'm not surprised. I'm so sorry that you had to do this. And it's just fine. I'm not surprised at all. And really, finally, I felt a great relief. Now, I had learned from the pain clinic doctor who he had referred me to, the guy who wanted to give me Butrans, from his DEA lecture and from the pain clinics who wouldn't see me because I was taking Suboxone. I wasn't sure how I was going to find a new doctor, but I felt a great relief just to be shed of this primary care physician. And then after I read his notes, it was even more. I mean, again, he wouldn't have been confused or confounded if he had just asked me a question. So I walked out of that appointment dismissed from the practice, holding in hand a prescription for 400 tablets of oxycodone, 3,600 milligrams worth, to go get filled. So I had to find a new doctor, and that wasn't easy. And we'll pick up with that in part 5. Till then, it's always good to see you.